The forest was silent, save for the rustling of leaves beneath Sarah's boots and the occasional snap of a twig breaking underfoot. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn afternoon. Too perfect, she thought, to pass up a walk through the woods. But as Sarah ventured deeper, the golden sunlight began to fade, and an unsettling chill swept through the trees, making the hairs on her neck stand on end. She wasn't sure why she felt uneasy. Maybe it was the emptiness of the forest, or perhaps the way the trees seemed to loom over her like silent sentinels. She quickened her pace, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the unease only grew. Something wasn't right, something she couldn't put her finger on. Suddenly, she heard the sound of paws padding softly against the forest floor. Sarah stopped and turned, her heart skipping a beat. Behind her, a stray dog stood, looking at her with curious eyes. It was a scruffy, small dog, no collar, completely out of place in the dense forest. Sarah hesitated, wondering where it had come from. She wasn't sure why, but something about the dog made her feel strangely comforted. She smiled, kneeling down to pet it, but as her hand reached out, the dog immediately darted ahead, looking back at her, almost as though urging her to follow. Intrigued, Sarah got back to her feet and decided to follow. The dog trotted ahead of her, weaving through the trees, but never straying too far. She thought it was a harmless diversion, something to pass the time, until the air grew colder and the shadows grew longer. Then, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving in the distance. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by a rustling sound that sent a wave of dread through her. Sarah froze, fear flooding her chest. She glanced around but saw nothing. The growl came again, louder this time, as if whatever was lurking was moving closer. Before she could react, the dog suddenly positioned itself between her and the source of the growl, standing firm as if it sensed the danger ahead. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear: the dog was protecting her. Little did she know, this small, unassuming dog was about to save her from something far more terrifying than she could ever imagine. What it protected her from would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about the woods and the creatures that roamed them. The woods were eerily quiet, a silence that felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Sarah's footsteps, once crisp and steady, now felt muffled, swallowed by the thick blanket of fallen leaves. The trees, their bare branches swaying gently in the wind, cast long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. The sunlight that had been so warm and inviting when she first entered now seemed distant, fading, as if the forest was slowly pulling her into its depths, away from the world she knew. The cold air bit at her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. She wrapped her arms tighter around her body, trying to shake off the chill that settled deep within her bones. The woods had always been a place of comfort, a sanctuary she'd walked through countless times in her life. But today there was something different. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled trunks stretching upward like twisted arms, their branches whispering in the wind like ghostly voices. A sudden rustle from behind broke the silence, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes snapped around, but there was nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees, making the shadows dance. She took a step forward, then another, her senses on high alert. The growl from earlier still echoed in her mind, a sound she couldn't shake. Her breath quickened, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the weight of the forest was growing with each passing moment. Her mind raced. Was she imagining it? Had she heard something? The forest was known for its eerie sounds, but this felt different. The growl. It had been deep, almost primal, like something lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. Sarah felt the weight of her own anxiety creeping up on her. She glanced over her shoulder, but the dog was still there, its eyes watching her intently, its small body tense. It didn't move, but somehow, Sarah knew it was aware of the danger lurking just out of sight. A cold, unseen presence seemed to press in on her, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. The growl came again, closer this time, sending a jolt of panic through her chest. She tightened her grip on her coat, trying to steady her breath. This wasn't just an ordinary walk in the woods. It was something far more sinister, and Sarah was only beginning to realize just how deep the darkness in these woods ran. Sarah had always been drawn to the woods. It wasn't just the quiet solitude or the escape from the bustle of daily life. It was the way the forest felt like an old friend, a constant companion that never judged her. Growing up in a small town nestled at the edge of the forest, she had spent countless hours wandering its trails, finding comfort in the rustling of leaves, the calls of birds, and the scent of pine that filled the air. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could leave the weight of the world behind and reconnect with herself. But now, at 27, Sarah was at a crossroads in her life. Her once strong connection with the forest had begun to fray. The familiar paths she used to take seemed more daunting now, and the trees, once welcoming, now felt imposing, their towering trunks looming over her like silent sentinels. The calm she once felt here was gone, replaced with a quiet unease that gnawed at her. It wasn't just the woods that had changed. It was her. Over the past year, Sarah's life had spiraled in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her mother, the one person who had always encouraged her to find peace in the forest, had passed away unexpectedly, leaving Sarah with an overwhelming sense of loss. That loss had seeped into every corner of her life, leaving her feeling hollow and adrift. Her relationship with her father had been strained for years. He had always been emotionally distant, a man of few words who had difficulty expressing his feelings. After her mother's death, the silence between them only grew. Their once solid bond seemed fragile, and every attempt at reconciliation felt like a failed effort, a reminder of what was lost. Sarah had tried to fill the void left by her mother's passing by throwing herself into work, taking long walks in the woods to clear her mind, but nothing seemed to fill the emptiness. She had come to the forest today seeking answers, or at least some relief from the tangled thoughts that clouded her mind. As she walked deeper into the woods, memories of her mother bubbled to the surface, uninvited but insistent. Her mother's soft voice echoing in her ears, her constant reminder that the forest was always there for her. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were no longer the safe place they once were. It wasn't just her grief that weighed on her. It was the growing sensation that something was wrong, something dark and unnatural that had taken root in the heart of the forest. The dog was the first to break her out of her thoughts. At first, it had seemed like a harmless animal, its fur a mix of brown and black, its eyes filled with a strange intensity. Sarah had seen it before, lingering at the edge of the woods, but never this close. Now the dog walked beside her, almost as if it were guiding her, its pace steady, its gaze never leaving her. There was something about it that set her on edge, but she didn't know why. Maybe it was the way it seemed to sense her unease, or the way its eyes followed her movements, unblinking. It was unlike any dog she had ever encountered in the woods. And yet, there was something comforting about it, too. Its presence felt like a shield, an unspoken promise that she wasn't alone. The more she walked, the more Sarah realized how much she had changed. She used to be able to walk through these woods without a second thought, but now every snap of a twig, every rustling of leaves, sent a wave of anxiety crashing over her. The forest felt more oppressive, its shadows deeper and darker than ever before. The dog, though, remained by her side, its presence a constant reassurance in the growing unease. Sarah's mind drifted back to her mother, the way she used to take her hand when they walked together through the forest. Her mother had always known how to calm her, to make the world feel less heavy. But now, that comfort was gone, and Sarah was left to face the unknown on her own. The dog's presence seemed to remind her that she wasn't completely alone, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The growl she'd heard earlier seemed to reverberate in her ears, its sound more real now than ever before. Something was watching her. Despite her fears, Sarah tried to push them aside. She had come to the woods to find answers, to seek out some kind of peace. She had always believed that the forest had a way of healing, of offering guidance when it was needed most. But as she walked deeper into the woods, the unease only grew stronger. The dog, still by her side, seemed to sense it too, its body tense, its ears alert. It was as though the animal understood the forest better than Sarah did, that it knew things she couldn't yet comprehend. And somehow, Sarah knew that this dog, this strange, watchful creature, was the key to uncovering the truth behind the growing darkness in the woods. But what would she find? And was she prepared for what the dog was guiding her towards? The questions lingered in Sarah's mind, unanswered, as the forest stretched out before her. A place that had once been a refuge now shrouded in mystery and fear. The silence of the woods pressed down on Sarah, heavy and unyielding. The air felt thick, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. The dog, still walking beside her, had not made a sound since it had appeared at the edge of the trail. Its eyes remained focused ahead, its every step in sync with hers, as if it was leading her deeper into the heart of the forest. The deeper Sarah went, the more she felt the unsettling shift in the atmosphere, the quiet gnawing feeling that something was not right. Her thoughts turned to the strange sensation she had experienced earlier, the one that made her feel like she was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It was something far more tangible, something she couldn't explain. She couldn't shake the image of the shadows moving in ways they shouldn't. In all her years of walking these woods, Sarah had never felt this uneasy. It was as though the very trees had turned against her, or worse, someone was hiding among them, waiting for the right moment to strike. She paused for a moment, the cool breeze brushing against her face as she tried to steady her breath. The dog, sensing her hesitation, stopped too, looking up at her with an almost knowing gaze. Sarah frowned. "What is it?" she whispered, as though the dog could answer. It growled low in its throat, and Sarah immediately tensed. It was a deep, almost guttural sound, a warning. Her heart raced as she looked around, but there was nothing but the trees and the eerie stillness of the forest. Then it came a sound, a twig snapping from somewhere off to the left. Sarah whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands clammy. Her eyes scanned the shadows, but nothing emerged. Her breathing quickened. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice shaky. The only reply was the rustling of leaves in the wind, too soft and too faint to be anything other than natural. But Sarah knew it wasn't natural. She could feel the presence lurking just beyond her vision, just beyond her reach. "Stay close," Sarah murmured, her voice barely a whisper as she slowly began to move again, the dog trailing at her heels. She couldn't explain it, but something deep within her told her that she was being led somewhere. The dog seemed to know exactly where it was going. Its instincts were unshakable, its path unwavering, and Sarah was too consumed by the unease swirling in her chest to question it. The further they went, the more Sarah felt herself pulled into the unknown. The familiar trail she had once walked so many times was now unfamiliar, distorted by the growing sense of danger that gripped her. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like gnarled hands reaching out to grab her. And yet, despite the fear creeping up her spine, Sarah couldn't stop herself from following. She had to know. The dog led her to a clearing, a small, hidden place deep within the woods, one Sarah had never seen before. The sunlight, weak and dappled through the thick canopy above, fell in patches across the moss-covered ground. It was peaceful, but the peacefulness felt wrong. There was an unsettling stillness, as though the clearing itself was holding its breath. The dog's movements became more purposeful, its body tense, and Sarah instinctively knew that this was no ordinary place. As she stepped into the clearing, a sudden chill swept over her. The air felt colder here, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She shivered despite the warmth of the sun. And that's when she saw it, a figure standing at the far edge of the clearing. It was tall, cloaked in a dark, tattered robe, its face obscured by a hood that seemed to swallow the light. The figure stood motionless, its posture rigid, as though it was waiting. Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Her first instinct was to run, to turn and flee back the way she came. But the dog remained by her side, its low growl vibrating through her feet, as though warning her not to move. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay still. "Who are you?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but she could feel its gaze upon her, even though she couldn't see its eyes. The air felt thick with an oppressive energy, a weight that pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. She took a tentative step forward. The dog growled louder now, more insistent, but Sarah ignored it, driven by a need to know what was happening. She stepped closer, and the figure finally spoke, its voice a low rasp, as though it hadn't used its voice in years. "You should not have come here," it said, its words carrying an unnatural echo. "This place is not for you." Sarah's blood ran cold. The hair on her arms stood on end as she stepped back, instinctively moving away from the figure. The dog growled again, a fierce, guttural sound that sent a shock of adrenaline through her. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. "What do you want?" Sarah demanded, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "Why are you here?" The figure raised a hand slowly, as if it had all the time in the world. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thickening as the figure's hand reached out toward her. "You have been chosen," it said cryptically. "The forest watches. The forest waits." Before Sarah could react, the dog lunged forward, its powerful body slamming into the figure. The impact was sudden, brutal, and the figure staggered back with a howl, its form flickering like a shadow in the dim light. The dog wasn't done. It growled and snapped at the figure, pushing it further back, forcing it to retreat into the trees. Sarah stood frozen, her heart racing. The dog's protective instincts had kicked in, and in that moment, she realized that it wasn't just a dog. It was her protector, guiding her, shielding her from whatever malevolent force lurked in the depths of the forest. "Go!" Sarah shouted, urging the dog to back away. The creature had retreated, its presence still lingering in the air like a bad omen. The dog hesitated for a moment before returning to her side, its eyes darting back toward the forest as if it were expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to the dog, breathless, her hand on the dog's back. The air around them felt different now, less oppressive but still thick with the unknown. She had learned something vital in that moment. There was something dark in the forest, something ancient and dangerous, and it had been watching her. Whatever had led her here, she couldn't turn back now. The dog had saved her, but there was more to uncover. The mystery of the forest, the figure, and the strange forces at play were only beginning to unravel. And Sarah knew one thing for sure: she couldn't walk away. The air grew heavier as Sarah and the dog began walking back toward the path, but the feeling of unease still clung to her like a dark cloud. The dog, ever watchful, stayed close by her side, its eyes scanning the surrounding woods, as though it sensed something even she couldn't. Sarah's heart was still pounding, adrenaline surging through her veins, but her mind was racing with questions. What had that figure been? What did it mean when it said she'd been chosen? She shook her head, trying to banish the thoughts. She had to get out of here. The deep silence of the woods seemed to press in on her, amplifying her every breath, each step more treacherous than the last. She could still hear the eerie echoes of the figure's voice in her mind, like a whisper on the wind. The forest watches. The forest waits. But she had to keep moving. Every inch of her body screamed for her to run, but her legs felt too heavy, her feet dragging across the forest floor, unwilling to obey. Something wasn't right. She could feel it deep in her bones. A chill had settled in the pit of her stomach, and though the sun had broken through the trees above, the warmth it offered did nothing to ease the growing tension. The woods had shifted in the few minutes she had been standing there, and now everything felt wrong. The dog stopped suddenly, its ears pricked forward, and Sarah froze. Her breath hitched in her chest. There was something ahead. The usual sounds of the forest, the wind rustling the leaves, the chirping of birds, had disappeared. In their place was an unsettling stillness, a quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. Sarah's pulse quickened as she tried to make sense of what she was feeling. She looked around but saw nothing. No movement, no sign of life. But the dog, its fur bristling with tension, clearly sensed something she didn't. "Come on, boy," she whispered, but the dog didn't budge. Instead, it took a few cautious steps forward, its body low to the ground, its nose twitching. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to follow, but something compelled her to. Slowly, she moved with the dog, careful not to make a sound. The feeling of being watched was back, even stronger than before. She could feel eyes on her, hidden just out of view, and her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to run as fast as she could. But she couldn't. The strange pull was still there, dragging her deeper into the woods, as if the forest itself was calling to her. The dog's growl grew louder, more insistent, as though urging her to turn back, but she pressed on. As they continued deeper, a strange fog began to roll in, creeping from the forest floor like a living thing, wrapping itself around her ankles and making it harder to see. The sun was fading, its light becoming muted through the growing mist. The shadows in the trees lengthened, twisting into strange shapes that seemed to move on their own. Sarah's breath became shallow, and her heart raced. She was afraid now, afraid of what was coming and afraid of what she couldn't see. And then it happened. A voice, faint but unmistakable, it cut through the silence. Sarah's head snapped to the side, her heart leaping into her throat. She'd heard it before, that rasping voice. It was the figure from the clearing. She had no doubt about it. Sarah. The voice seemed to come from all directions at once. You cannot leave. You are already part of it. Her stomach twisted in fear, but she forced herself to look around. The dog was on edge, its tail tucked between its legs, its growls turning into low whimpers. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the words lingered in her mind, echoing with a growing sense of dread. You're not real, she whispered, her voice shaky, but she knew it wasn't true. She could feel the presence, the dark energy closing in around her. She took another step, but before she could react, something moved in the mist. A figure. It was just a silhouette at first, an indistinct shadow moving against the fog. It was tall and wide, the outline shifting as if it was made of smoke. Sarah's blood ran cold. The figure's face remained hidden, but there was something haunting about its form, something disturbingly familiar. Felt like the same thing from the clearing. The dog barked sharply, a low, warning bark, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, watching. Sarah's throat went dry. The air was thick with tension, and the fog seemed to draw closer, swallowing everything in its path. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All she could do was stare at the figure, her mind screaming for her to run, but her body frozen in place. Then the figure stepped forward. Its movements were slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment, enjoying the terror it was causing. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, and her hands shook as she gripped the dog's collar. The dog had gone completely still, its muscles tensed, ready to spring into action. But Sarah didn't want to fight. She wanted to understand, to know what this thing was and why it had followed her, why it had called her into the woods. You don't belong here, the voice rasped again, echoing in the silence. I don't want any part of this, Sarah breathed, her voice barely audible. She didn't know if she was talking to the figure or to herself. I just want to leave. The figure took another step forward, its shape becoming clearer through the mist. It seemed to loom larger with each movement, its form more defined, more menacing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the true danger she was in. She wasn't just lost in the woods. She was being drawn deeper into something darker, something that wasn't going to let her go. The fog swirled around her ankles, thick and suffocating. It was closing in inch by inch. The dog let out a low whine, pulling against its collar as though it too was struggling to resist the pull of the mist. Sarah's legs trembled, and a wave of panic surged through her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears, and her thoughts were scattered. Why me? She whispered, her voice barely carrying over the growing wind. The figure said nothing in return, but its presence was enough to answer her question. She had been chosen, and now there was no escape. The fog seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. Every step Sarah took was met with a growing resistance, as if the very ground beneath her was turning against her. Her mind raced, and in the back of her mind, she felt something else, something lurking in the shadows just out of sight. It was there, waiting, and in that moment she knew the true danger was yet to come. The mist thickened, wrapping itself around Sarah's legs like a creeping vine, holding her in place. The figure before her loomed larger, its dark shape now fully visible, the eerie, almost human-like features of its face indistinguishable from the fog. Its hollow eyes seemed to burn with a sinister glow, and its mouth moved in slow, deliberate movements as if savoring the fear it was causing. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine as her heart hammered violently in her chest. The dog, though still tense, seemed to sense Sarah's panic, its deep growls resonating through the quiet woods. She could feel its muscles coil, ready to spring into action. The animal's protective instinct was the only thing keeping her grounded in the face of overwhelming terror. It was her only ally in this dark, twisted moment. Her breaths came in sharp, ragged gasps. "What do you want from me?" Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. The figure didn't answer, but its presence was like a weight pressing on her chest, suffocating her. The figure's hands moved next. Slowly, it lifted them, and Sarah could see the unnatural, elongated fingers reaching out to her, as if beckoning her into the fog. She took a shaky step back, but the ground beneath her seemed to shift, pulling her forward with an unseen force. She was trapped. No escape. The forest was closing in on her, and she could feel its hunger, its malice, like an oppressive force that didn't belong in the natural world. Then, a voice, this time familiar, the sound of someone who had been here before. "Don't let it take you." Sarah spun around, her heart leaping into her throat as she recognized the voice. It was the same voice from the clearing. The figure had been watching her even then. She had felt its presence, the unseen watcher in the dark. But now, its warning echoed in her ears, clear and sharp. Who are you?" Sarah gasped, trying to make sense of it all. In a flash, the fog parted, revealing a person. A woman, standing only a few feet away, her face barely visible in the shadows. She looked familiar. Her features were blurry at first, but as Sarah's eyes adjusted, she saw her more clearly. Her face was worn, haunted, but there was an intensity to her gaze, a strength beneath the fear that reflected the same terror Sarah had been feeling since entering these woods. "I'm like you," the woman said, her voice low and urgent. "I was chosen, too, but I escaped. You can, too." The figure in front of Sarah seemed to stir at the mention of escape. Its movement was fluid, almost inhuman, as it began to glide toward them, its face twisting into a mockery of a smile. Sarah's blood ran cold. The thing was coming closer. "You can't outrun it," the woman said, stepping in front of Sarah, her body tense. "It has power over these woods, over the forest itself. But you have something it doesn't." "What do I have?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she grasped at the words, unsure whether to believe the woman or not. The figure was almost upon them now, its shape becoming more defined, its features sharper. The woman took a step forward, standing her ground. "You have the dog. It's the key. The forest doesn't want it here, but it's part of the balance. You've been drawn in because of it." Sarah's mind whirled as she processed the words. She had been drawn into the woods because of the dog? That didn't make sense. But as the fog seemed to pulse and shift, and as the figure's hands stretched forward, an icy chill ran through her, and she knew instinctively that the woman's words were true. "The dog," Sarah repeated, looking down at the animal beside her. The dog, though still tense, seemed to hold a quiet strength. It was calm now, its fur bristling with an energy Sarah hadn't noticed before, a spark of determination in its dark eyes. She had felt it. There was a connection between them, something deep, primal. "Listen to it," the woman urged, her voice strained. "The forest's curse can't be broken by just anyone. You need the dog. You need to trust it, and you need to trust yourself." The figure lunged at them with terrifying speed, its twisted face now fully visible, its grin wide and grotesque. The woman pushed Sarah back, shielding her as the figure's clawed hands reached for her. The dog acted in an instant. With a deep, resounding bark, it lunged forward, its teeth snapping at the figure. The creature hissed in fury, recoiling from the dog's strength and determination. For a moment, the forest itself seemed to pause, as if the very trees and the ground beneath them were holding their breath. The woman's eyes locked with Sarah's. "You have to do it now. Take the dog and run. It won't let you go unless you break the bond." "Break the bond?" Sarah asked, her mind spinning. What did she mean? How could she? But before she could finish, the figure shrieked, a sound that tore through the air, rattling the very earth beneath them. The ground trembled, and Sarah could feel the weight of the creature's fury building. "The bond! The dog! It's the key!" the woman shouted, pushing Sarah forward. Suddenly, everything fell into place. The dog wasn't just her companion. It was something more, something tied to the very fabric of this cursed place. The connection was undeniable. Sarah realized the forest wasn't after her, but after the dog. The creature was drawn to it, not to her. And if she could separate herself from that bond, maybe, just maybe, she could escape. The woman turned to face the figure, and in that moment, Sarah saw the resolve in her eyes, the determination to end this, to free herself and anyone who came after. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed the dog's collar tightly and backed away, her eyes on the figure, her heart racing. The dog, sensing her urgency, broke free, tearing away from the creature's grasp with a force that shook the very air. The figure howled in rage, its form flickering like a dying flame, its essence weakening. The woman raised her hands and chanted something in a language Sarah didn't understand, the words like ancient whispers carried by the wind. The figure writhed in agony as it began to dissolve, fading into the fog like smoke. The air crackled, the tension lifting as the creature's presence faded into nothingness. Sarah stumbled backward, her legs weak, as the fog began to dissipate, leaving nothing but the normal silence of the woods in its wake. The dog barked once, a sharp, victorious sound that echoed through the trees. "You're safe now," the woman said, her voice calm but weary. "It's over. For now." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. But as the fog cleared, she turned to the woman, her eyes wide with a new realization. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. The woman gave her a faint, sad smile. "You don't owe me anything, but you'll never be truly free until you understand what the forest wants. You'll need to find out, before it comes back." With that, the woman vanished into the mist, leaving Sarah standing in the woods with the dog by her side. The journey wasn't over. The forest still had secrets, and she knew she would never be able to escape it until she uncovered the truth. But for now, she was safe. For now, they had won. As Sarah stood alone in the clearing, the dog by her side, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had just experienced was more than just a nightmare. It was a transformation. The woods, once a place of beauty, now seemed like an enigmatic, living force, one that she had barely begun to understand. She had come to this place searching for answers, unknowingly walking into something far darker than she had ever imagined. The dog, her companion, had been more than just a protector. It had been her guide, her connection to the very heart of the forest. Without it, she wouldn't have had the strength to face the horrors that lurked in the fog, the entity that had haunted her steps. There was an unspoken bond between them now, a silent understanding that neither of them could ignore. Reflecting on her journey, Sarah realized how much she had changed. Before this night, she had been a woman lost in her own fears, haunted by doubts and insecurities. But now, standing in the same woods that had almost claimed her life, she felt a newfound strength. She had faced her deepest fears, confronted something evil, and survived. Yet, even as the fog lifted and the silence returned to the woods, Sarah couldn't help but feel that her story wasn't finished. The woman she had met in the mist had been a warning, a reminder that the forest's curse was still out there, waiting for its next victim. It wasn't just a place, it was a force, and it wouldn't rest until it had claimed what it wanted. Sarah knew now that her connection to the dog wasn't a mere coincidence. It was the key to understanding the forest's true nature, to unlocking its dark secrets. There was more to this forest than met the eye, and Sarah wasn't ready to walk away just yet. She had learned that fear wasn't something to run from, it was something to face head-on. And she wasn't alone anymore. With the dog by her side, Sarah understood that no matter what came next, she had the strength to survive it. But one question lingered in her mind: would she ever be truly free? Or would the forest, with all its hidden dangers, come for her again? The answers were out there, deep in the woods, and Sarah knew she had no choice but to keep searching. For now, though, she walked away, the dog faithfully following her footsteps, the silent bond between them stronger than ever. And in the distance, the woods waited, as mysterious and deadly as ever. The story was far from over. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling journey through the woods, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, mysterious stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think the forest's secrets are? Drop your predictions or any eerie experiences you've had in the comments below. And if you're craving more suspense and unexpected twists, don't forget to stay tuned for our upcoming videos. Join our growing community of horror lovers. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of the mystery.